So take it away.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and good evening, everybody. I'm Helen Robertson. I'm in South Australia, and I'm giving a talk on donkey colour genetics, such as one knows them, and some comments on donkey colour and markings. So thank you very much for inviting me. Now, we'll go to the first slide. Now, there'll be a series of, I think it's 23 photos. There's some writing by them. Now, the grey dun colour, as you can see with this donkey and a smaller one behind, is the commonest colour of donkeys in the world. And it's the colour of the donkey's original ancestors. So the ancestral donkeys are the African wild ass, and they live in the stony semi-deserts of northeast Africa. They used to be all through many parts of what are now Somalia, the Somalian areas, the Ethiopian areas, Eritrea, Nubia, other parts of sort of northeast Africa that have these sort of stony semi-deserts. And this is why in Australia donkeys do very well in the Kimberley and the northern and the Flinders Ranges and these types of areas that are similar to their original habitat. You'll notice that donkey hooves grow too long if they're in any country that's softer than a stony semi-desert. But in that kind of country, their hooves stay good without being trimmed. Now, you will see on most of the slides a series of letters in capitals and small letters. Some of you may be aware of the conventions for detailing the genetics of horse colours. Others of you will be unfamiliar with it. The E is called extension, and that's a gene that allows colour, which is black or red, which is eumelanin or pheomelanin, the black-brown colours of melanin and the red-yellow colours of melanin, who extend into the hairs in different parts of the body. And the agouti, the A, is a gene that allows the body to produce both black and red. So, and the D stands for dun, which is the dilution of the body colour, and the primitive markings, which are the cross and other black markings on donkeys. So in all the horse-related animals of the world, the African donkeys, the Asiatic wild asses, the horses, the zebras, there's about 7 species in all, they all have this same underlying arrangement that gives them their colour. They have extension and agouti and dun. And even though you think that a zebra looks black and white and a horse looks a reddish brown colour, etc., they all have this same underlying set of genes that dictate their colour. A zebra is actually a very, very, very dilute colour, not quite white, a sort of creamy colour, with not just one shoulder stripe, but stripes more or less elaborated over the whole coat. So the background colour of zebras is actually the areas of the donkey which are the grey colour. And you see this when you see a hybrid between a zebra and a donkey, that it has a greyish brown body with dark stripes on it. And that shows you what's actually going on. Now, that grey dun donkey, if we go to the next slide, Keith will move it on to the next number 2. Yes. So the grey dun colour comes in a variety of shades, and you can see these ones have a slightly more brownish shade. One of the difficulties with showing slides or pictures, photos on the electronic media is that a lot of cameras and screens change the colour values very slightly. and it's actually very hard to judge just how brownish or greyish a donkey coat is on a lot of screens. The first donkey and these two donkeys are slightly different shades if you see them in the paddock together. But this very slightly brownish shade, I don't think constitutes anything other than just a slight variant in grey dun, just like bay horses come in a number of shades. You'll notice the thing that's very common in donkeys, which is that the ears, the backs of the ears and the areas between the pale parts on the face and the darker colour have yellowish or reddish tonings, and so they show out this yellowish or reddish pigment on different parts of their faces, even though their bodies can look quite a cool colour. The primitive markings, as they're called, are there's a dorsal stripe that goes all the way from the top of the head down through the mane, down the middle of the back, down the tail, all the way to the black tuft at the end, and across the shoulders, and black bars going transversely on the legs, and black edging to the ears, and a dark area at the base of the ear. And the nostril rims and muzzle tip are dark. It's not obvious when you take side view pictures of donkeys. At the very, very end of this slideshow, there's actually a photograph of a donkey with his muzzle straight towards the camera, and you can actually see where this dark hair is. It's very obvious in foals, but in the adult donkeys, quite often this hair becomes paler again. But it is part of the primitive markings in the duns. And some of them have a midline dark stripe down the middle of their belly, which you see if they're rolling, but they don't all have that. And the dun is technically called a dilution because the colour is only partially colouring the hair, but it's very different to other dilutions. In most dilute colours, the whole hair has a reduced amount of pigment in it. In dun, this natural wild colour of all the equines, the colour is only in one side of the hair shaft. So in the hair follicle, the cells that produce colour are only on one side of the hair follicle, and they only put colour on one side of the hair shaft. So the colour is pale on the body, diluted by simply having the hair only half coloured on one side. And so a donkey that has no dun will have a hair that is completely coloured. The cells are around the whole of the hair follicle, and the colour is laid into the whole hair shaft. One can also get animals which have a degree of dun. They'll have a mutation of the dun gene, but not where it's completely stopping working, and so they'll have colour to a larger extent, but still on only one side. But a larger part of the circumference of the hair will have colour. This has been shown very clearly with horses, with the dun horses, the non-dun horses, and intermediate versions of dun. And in horses, there are genetic tests for these different variants, and very, very nice photographs of microscopic studies of the hairs, which you can see online. The markings of the donkey, the primitive markings as they're called, are obviously not diluted in the duns. The markings, the dun colour, the pale belly, the pale muzzle, and so on, they're both for camouflage and for social signalling. So the situation where the muzzle is pale, the eye rings are pale, and the belly is pale in horses is called pangare, P-A-N-G-A-R-E, and in donkeys it's obviously a related genetic issue, and you can see it in mules. So the pangery in donkeys is much more clearly delineated. You'll see a sharp division between the white of the belly and the colour further up the ribs, and similarly on the muzzle and eye rings. There's quite a clear-cut division between the two colours. In horses, if a horse has pangery, and some breeds like the Exmoor ponies have it commonly, then the divisions are much blurrier. You'll see the ancestral colouring in horses if you look at a Przewalski wild horse. So with camouflage, this pattern of dark top, pale belly produces what's called counter shading, and it tends to make it so that the shadow of the belly and so on is partly removed, so that it flattens the colour when seen at a great distance. The general colour of the donkeys, the grey dun colour, matches the stony semi-desert general tone colourings in the distance, and so tends to blend in. If ever any of you have tried to find a donkey in stony semi-desert or mallee country, or against a background of sparse grey-green mallee trees and acacias and things, you will know they can actually just disappear into the background completely, especially at dawn and dusk. And the shoulder stripe will be, and the other leg striping will have some bearing on that. However, with experiments have shown with equines that the very heavy striping, like in zebras, makes it hard for particular types of biting flies that often carry disease, especially in Africa. Those flies, for some reason, their visual system means that they find it difficult to land on stripes. Donkeys tend to have heavy striping on the legs, especially one of the wild subspecies. And the amount of striping on equines geographically fits in with the amount of danger they have from diseases from these biting flies. The other thing with colour patterning with equines will be social signalling. As people would know, equines like to socialise, show their social affinity with one another by scratching at the wither with their teeth. You'll see them standing head to tail and busy chewing away at the back line, particularly at the top of the wither. It's very likely that the shoulder cross in equines, because it occurs across all the species to some degree or another, is actually a marker of scratch here. And the facial markings with donkeys, you can see how distinct they are. And when you're relatively close, within 10 metres, 20 metres of a donkey, you can see very clearly where its ears are, which way it's facing, and all sorts of other aspects of its facial expression and body language signalling. Whereas in the distance, it acts as camouflage, but close up it acts as social signalling. And this sort of thing is very common in animals, to have markings which have multiple functions. And of course, with domestication, we've selected for interesting colours and oddities and so on. And the animals just have to learn how to live without the ancestral signals that they would have had. One of my donkeys, which had only ever seen donkeys with the common distribution of colour, was off somewhere else. I think it was somewhere in the eastern states. And one of the first donkeys she met there was one which had been bred to have a completely different patterning. So it had a dark muzzle, dark eye rings, and largely white otherwise. And apparently my donkey looked extremely startled, because it was completely not what it expected. Now, if you could put on the next slide, thanks. So this one, black with light points. So this donkey has got pangery with the belly and muzzle eye rings light, but it has no dun. There's no dilution at all. The donkeys are absolutely solidly pigmented black, but it has a little bit of yellowish edging around the facial markings, which is very common with the black ones with light points. And that then corresponds to again the dominant genes at extension and agouti, but a recessive gene for no dun, and the recessive gene for no dun has to be homozygous to show. So and this, in fact, this animal you will commonly get 2 grey duns, each carrying a gene for non-dun, and then they will put out a black foal. And it's a very, very common type of thing, because the Australian Teamster donkeys are commonly a grey dun, but a large number of them are black with light points, or, as we'll see shortly, brown with light points. And so grey duns carrying the non-dun colours will commonly have foals with these other colours. Because there are variations in the degree of dun dilution, you will get some blacks which are not perfectly pitch black, and in bright light you can see their primitive markings. You can see a cross. Now, if we have the next photo, next one, Keith. Oh yeah, here we go. So this donkey is dark brown, again with no dun. So he's very strongly pigmented in dark brown. Now, and he's got some yellowish reddish tonings around his facial markings and also down on his hindquarters. These ones, the lower legs are blacker than the brown of the body. It's really quite believable that they are genetically related to the bay of horses. The brown of donkeys is an area of contention, because there's quite obviously grey dun donkeys that have colours that, if you pointed to them on a colour chart, would look grey, and they come in different tones, from ones which are more towards fawn or more towards beige or more yellowish, but they're still grey colours. And then sometimes they're darker and they're charcoaly colours, and then all the way through to the blacks. But there's another series of colours in donkeys which are brown, and you'll get animals which are definitely a browner kind of shade, and then, and we'll see in a moment, one with dun, and they can have, again, varying degrees of dun, and at their very darkest colour, they're very hard to distinguish from black unless you're in very bright light. And there's no genetic test for brown as differentiated from the grey dun black series. And so one of the things which will cause some people great irritation is arguing over whether a donkey is actually brown or actually a grey dun. Some of the Australian Teamster donkey mobs in the bush make it clear that there is a genetic switch, but there's probably lots and lots of modifying genes. You will get some, so you get a population of donkeys like the English-Irish donkeys, where there are lots of donkeys that are various shades of brown with dun. So they've got primitive markings, they've got brownish coloured coats, and they come in various shades from fairly light browns through sort of cigar coloured and darker types of browns. It's very common in the English-Irish donkey. But in the Australian bush, you'll get mobs of donkeys that come just in 2 colours, grey duns, brown duns, and there's simply one or the other. And in that case, it's pretty obvious that the mob had a very small foundation population. There are certainly mobs of Australian Teamsters out in the bush where there were only a handful of donkeys brought to a mine site in the 1800s for work, and they bred up from there. And some areas, the country is sufficiently harsh that mobs aren't really able to move to other districts, and so you get isolated groups that have been breeding up for many generations. And if the foundation population had very little colour variant in it, you can get things where, for example, there was a choice between the grey dun colour and the brown colour, but no modifying genes to produce the array of colours that you can see in the English-Irish donkeys. And it makes it quite obvious that there is something different about brown and grey dun. They're not simply a variation along a line, but nobody knows what the genetic switch is, or it's not in the usual. The people in the USA who've done some of the genetics for donkeys at University California Davis campus They haven't identified the brown in the agouti genes as a variant of that gene, because they've looked there, and it also doesn't appear as a place on the genetic system where brown occurs to give a brown dog. So there's something else that makes brown for donkeys, and nobody can do it. Somebody with lots and lots of money, the University of California and Davis, would be very happy to do the necessary research, but somebody's got to put up an awful lot of money and a very, very large number of samples from a very, very large number of donkeys from many origins. And quite understandably, that just hasn't happened. Now, if we could have the next slide. Now, this donkey, unfortunately, is taken at a time when shadows were falling over his body, but he is a brown, and he has got primitive markings. He's a brown dun, so his brown is a lighter colour, being diluted. You can actually see a rather long shoulder cross on him, and it would be much, much more obvious if we didn't have that unusual lighting effect on him. But so he's a brown dun, and there certainly are brown duns which are a lighter brown than that one. But he's got the light points, and so he's in that series. So if we could have the next slide. And this then is red. So the red donkeys, just like chestnut horses, have only red pigment, the pheomelanin pigment in their hair. That black spot, that spot on his hindquarters that looks as though it's a black spot, is actually a very dense red. If you see him when his coat is newly come out in summer and in very bright sunlight, that spot is quite obviously just a very dark red spot. And this Jack was born completely red from the hoof up, so he was a totally red animal with a white star. The red-coloured donkeys always at least roan out in the legs. In other words, they've got pigmented skin on their legs and faces and so on. The skin is dark coloured, but the hairs gradually come out white. And so even when a red donkey isn't particularly roan, they still get a certain amount of roan developing on their legs and face. In fact, this animal has roaned out a lot more than this as the years have gone by. You don't get red donkeys that stay red to the hoof. They always end up with a certain amount of white hair mixed into the legs. And often they have roan and end up with roan hair all over, as we'll see in subsequent pictures. So the genetics for this, the red, the extension, recessive gene at extension, that means they can only put red in their coat, not both red and black, means that he's got that small letter EE. Then there's two blank lines, which just mean that the agouti status is not known and it doesn't have any bearing on his redness. And then he's got non-dun. He hasn't got primitive markings at all. And now if we turn to the next slide, thanks. Now this is a red with dun. So this red is diluted to a degree and has the primitive markings. You can see the shoulder cross. This is quite a young animal, I think. You can see that white hair roaning is coming out in the legs. And there's a little bit of darker hair at the fetlock, and the dark hair of the cross is basically a dark brown, a dark red, rather than a black. Some red donkeys do have these areas that look rather black, but in very, very bright light, it looks to be a very, very dark red colour rather than black. So he's a red dun. And then if we turn on the next one. And so these mother and foal are both red roans with no dun. So the foal, as you can see, looks red all over with the white muzzle and belly, and no primitive markings. And she just looks beautifully red. However, her mother was that colour when she was born too. Her mother's now in her mid-teens in that photo, and she has roaned out until she's more or less looking at a distance. Look, she looks white. The skin is still dark all over, but the hairs have gradually become more and more white. But these are non-dun ones. They didn't show any primitive markings even before the dun started to take, even before the roan started to take effect. So they're red with no dun, but with the roan. So the roan and this progressive whitening of the coat is completely unrelated to horses. It's the grey of horses. It's a completely unrelated method by which the coat changes than the genetic grey of horses that makes them go from dark coloured foals through to snowy white older horses. Now, next slide, thanks. So this is now some roans. This jack here is a black roan with no dun. It's not terribly obvious at his age because he's now in his teens in that photo, but as a foal, the amount of coloured hair in his coat was greater, and he, you could see that the coloured hair through his coat was black, and there was no cross, no primitive markings. The grey dun roans, you'll see a ghost, even when they're quite roan, you'll still see a ghostly dark cross, still with the white hair in it. There's more or less 4 patterns or phenotypes of roan. It's not clear about the genetics of roan. However, it appears to be dominant in that each roan seems to have a roan parent, a dominant gene, and the several different phenotypes or appearances run in families, which suggests that there's actually a series of different roan genes. There are in horses. In horses, there are quite a lot of different mutations of a particular gene that's called KIT, K-I-T. The KIT gene mutations lead to roan in horses and also to many of the spotted patterns, the common sort of skewball, pieball type markings. And the spotted gene in donkeys, which we'll see shortly, the spotted gene in donkeys is also a mutation of the KIT gene. So the roan of donkeys is quite likely in the same gene, a mutation of the same gene. Some, like this particular one, are born with a lot of white hair in their coat and some coloured hair through the body and neck, head, and the white hairs become more prominent with time. The coloured hairs tend to gradually develop into blurry spots, sometimes quite distinct, sometimes quite indistinct, but nonetheless a reverse dapple pattern with darker spots on a lighter background. The Jenny behind is also she's a grey dun roan, and as you can see in her case, there's a lot less roan in her. She's just got light legs and face and still got a fairly coloured body. And if we can have the next picture. And so this is another shade of grey dun, and he's got roan, but it's the roan that produces, they're born grey dun all over, then produces white legs and white face, and then gradually producing dapples running up onto the shoulder and hindquarters area. There are roans which are born very dark and then gradually get more white hair. There's also a phenotype which have the lower legs remain fairly dark with only a limited amount of roan hair in them, and then they have a inverted V, an upside down V shape of the dark hair above the knee and hock, and then roaning onto the lower body and the body, and that's similar to what is commonly seen in horses, where roan horses have dark lower parts of their limbs with inverted V's. So it's interesting, there's one roan variant in donkeys that does the same thing, but most roans in donkeys get snowy white hair on their lower legs. Next picture. And so this is a roan who he was born a dark brownish sort of colour. It's not quite clear whether he's a very dark brown or a black as his base colour. You can see how he's got some reddish tonings on the ears, and he had them on his head. And he's about 10 here, and so he's beginning to get reverse dapples showing up over his whole body. So he's one that will gradually progress, and by the time he's in his 20s, he may well look pretty much white from a distance, or he may stay similar to what he is now. It does vary a bit. The very dark near black bodies with red tonings on the head, and in the case of horses on the flank, although in donkeys that doesn't show, is the seal brown colour of horses, the darkest of bays. And it's very likely that the colouring of the donkeys is the equivalent of the seal bay of horses with the more or less black bodies, rather than the red bay that one commonly sees in horses. Although very occasionally you will see photos of red bay looking donkeys. I haven't seen one for a long time, so I haven't had a chance to try to work out whether it's a part of the red series or part of the grey dun black with white points bay sort of series. One of the interesting things about red donkeys is that the horn of their hoof has got little white unpigmented streaks through it. So when you're trimming the hooves and you rasp the sole, not the sole, but the bottom side of the wall, the cut surface of the wall of the hoof, you'll see in red donkeys that it's a dappling sort of stripy sort of pattern of pigmented and unpigmented hoof horn, unlike donkeys that are grey duns or browns or blacks, where the cut surface is almost entirely pigmented, although there's occasionally a few flecks of unpigmented horn. So it happens in horses too. Red horses, chestnut horses, tend to have striped hoof horn with streaks of more and less pigmented hoof horn compared to an ordinary bay or black horse. And so there does seem to be some genetic thing happening there that helps you look for whether the animal's red or not red. Now, if we go to the next one. And so this is another dark brown roan with rather more white in her coat and rather more dappling. And then if you go to the next one. Click. And so this is the appearance of those last couple of donkeys when they're foals, looking dark brown. This one's about weaning age. I think she was about 7 months old. And so you'll see that she's beginning to roan around her lower legs. And there'd be a little bit of it appearing on her face. And she will look like her mother, who was the previous Jenny. She will look like her mother in a few years, even though you see these dark brown foals or grey dun foals and you think, oh, that's a nice donkey. And they are nice donkeys, but if they're roan, it's all going to change. But you can see the signs of roaning very, very early. Next one. And this is a roan, a grey dun roan. He's looking very red. The grey dun foals, he's only a few days old here. So grey dun foals often have rather red toned bodies and rather cool, dull grey coloured legs. It's very much in keeping with the theme of bay in horses with reddish bodies and black legs. However, as a grown up, and he will be the ordinary grey dun colour he is now as a 3-year-old an ordinary grey dun colour. People quite often go, oh, we've got a red foal. And I look at it and go, no, that's not a red foal. That's just a reddish foal coat, which occurs quite commonly. The fact that he has roan and is going to roan out and has indeed done so, you can see it in that his lower legs look a little bit pepper and salt. They haven't really got white hairs in them yet, but they've got pale hairs. So a little bit of pepper and salt appearance into the lower legs. And also on his muzzle, he's got a pigmented muzzle. The skin of his muzzle is all black, but all the hair of the muzzle is white. So all the hair around the lips and nostrils and so on is white. Whereas in foals that have not got roan, that are fully pigmented and not got roan, they will have a black rim of the hair on the rims of the nostrils, and the hair on the lips is black on black skin, and it's very distinct in the foals. But quite often as they grow up, the hair around the nostrils becomes lighter, and there's less of it. There's often just some darker hair around the lips. It's very hard to photograph, but it's very easily seen in the donkey itself. The very last picture at the end of the slideshow shows the muzzle of a black with light points donkey, showing the dark hair in these areas. Now, next picture. Now, yes, excuse, there's 2 or 3 photos here which are now they're taken in different situations where they're not really showing the donkey terribly well. But this is a fully frosted roan, fully frosted spotted roan. This donkey has got both genes, the gene for roan and the gene for spotting, so piebald, skewbald type colouring. And when donkeys inherit both spotting and roan, they commonly become very white very quickly in life. We know that this animal has spotting because you can see he's got a white hoof. You can see one of the hind feet is unpigmented, and in donkeys the unpigmented hoof like that, it corresponds to a white marking on that leg. Pictured as he is here, you can't really see particularly whether he's got other white patches or not, other unpigmented patches, but he probably does. He may not, though. The spotting gene can sometimes produce only very minimal white areas, but he would have been born looking like a spotted donkey with patches of colour and white, but very, very quickly turned this very white colour. You can see a bit of dark hair through his rump area. His base colour is hard to determine now, though sometimes you can work it out if you see them when they get a new coat in summer and the sun's shining brightly on it. You can work out what the base colour is, but it looks to be a dark one. So and I can't tell whether he's got dun or not because there's not enough colour left to see whether the primitive markings are there. It would have been obvious when he was a foal, probably. But he's not a red donkey. And the spotting gene in donkeys is always heterozygous. In other words, they always have one gene for spotting and one normal pigmentation gene, because the heterozygous spotting, so if they inherit a gene for spotting from both parents, the embryo dies very, very early in their pregnancy and they don't get born. And from the point of view of the person doing the breeding, the Jenny just seemed not to get pregnant on the first mating, but come into heat again and get pregnant on a second or third mating. So you don't get foals born that come into any strife. I think that the Americans have recorded 1 or 2 foals born to a spotted mating that is homozygous for spotting and has been born and then died soon after birth. But it's so very, very rare that it's not really a big welfare issue, unlike certain types of spotting genes in horses, where very abnormal foals are born that die. But if you always mate a non-spotted donkey to a spotted donkey, you'll be sure that you won't ever get a foal that's homozygous for spotting. They'll always be heterozygous, and there won't be any issues with these things. Red spotted donkeys, because they always have a degree of roaning anyway, red and donkeys that are red with spotting and roan out so fast that they always look white and might just have a little bit of red colour on their ear tips or something. Next picture. And so this is a grey dun donkey. Again, I'm sorry, the quality of lighting is not very good, but it's a grey dun donkey with spotting. And this is the common pattern where the patches of colour are over the sides of the head, the ears, neck, shoulder, and blobs on the other parts of the body. They commonly have at least one coloured leg, which is not so obvious in this Jenny. The spots often look like they've each been laid in separately and have slightly different colour tones to each other, which is very common in donkey spotting. So she's, again, a heterozygous for spotting type. The little bit of a little tiny white star on the forehead that you see in some donkeys is unrelated to the spotting gene. It's a separate issue. With the spotting gene, the level of expression is very different. You get some that have only a little bit of coloured patches on an almost entirely white donkey. They'll have just a few patches of colour on the head and the top of the shoulder. You'll get other ones like that fully frosted spotted one previously, where they're basically pigmented all over except for a patch on their forehead and perhaps a sock. Next picture, thanks. So this is another donkey with the frosted spotted roan type problem, a pattern, not a problem. He's got spotting. You can see some unpigmented skin on his muzzle and one hoof, and a general appearance that he looks like he's got patches of pigmented and unpigmented skin and hair. But there are dark spots, blurry spots, roany spots. You do see these not uncommonly. And mule foals that are born, or mules that are born from a donkey that has donkey roan and donkey spotting, will sometimes come out with this sort of patterning and can look quite elegant. Next one along. And this is, you'll see on the front end of this donkey, you see it's a brown spotted donkey, so its base colour is a brown. It doesn't have dun, so it's a non-dun donkey. And you can see near the front end, there's one patch of colour which is a very dark brown compared to the lighter brown patch next to it. Spotted donkeys commonly have patches which are different colours. You can get ones which are grey dun and black in different patches. Commonly, they're 2 shades of brown or 2 shades of grey dun in different patches. They're often referred to as somatic mutations because there's been some sort of genetic switch happen in the cell that in the embryo led to one patch of pigmented hair compared to another patch of pigmented hair, but a mutation that's occurred in a body cell and isn't passed on directly to the descendants. Next picture. Now this is the donkey which is black with no light points. Now it's not a lot of detail of the picture, but you can see that the donkey has black hair. It's the hair of the muzzle and the eye rings is black, and if you could see its belly, you'd see it had black hair there too. So it has no pangaree, and this one has no dun, so it has come out black. Now, this kind of black is different from the donkey with light points. These ones have got a recessive gene that they're homozygous for at agouti, and a dominant gene at extension. So they get the big E and then the two little A's for the being homozygous for the recessive agouti. This is the same genetic pattern as occurs in black horses. So black horses have got the recessive agouti gene, and so have no light point donkeys. And this genetic makeup has been studied in various breeds of donkeys in various places of the world and got the same result, that these donkeys with no light points are the equivalent of black horses genetically. Excuse me. And this one has no dun, but the no light points situation, these little a donkeys, they can be grey duns with no light points. They'll have blackish hair on their muzzle and eye rings. They can be brown, various shades of brown with or without dun, and similarly have black muzzles and eye rings. So they come in the range of colours of the blacks, the browns, the grey duns, and so on, with and without dun, but with the dark facial areas. And they're the equivalent of various variants on black in horses. Apparently the donkey drivers in South Australia used to refer to them as smoky-faced donkeys, especially the grey dun form. And in England, they would refer to them as smugglers' donkeys, the idea being they didn't show up in the dark. And it's a recessive gene, and it occurs quite widely around the world in different breeds of donkeys. And there's no red or yellow toning because they are, in fact, black-based animals. Next one. And this is a brown with no light points. So it's a brown dun. You can see the cross on the shoulders. So it's got dun, but it's got no light points. Next one. Please, next one. There we go. Now, with just some parts on the end here about dilute colours in donkeys. In general, in most parts of the world, people have simply bred donkeys to be hardy, good workers and not paid any particular attention to colour. And so we don't have large numbers of donkeys with dilute colours, unlike with horses where people have often bred all sorts of interesting combinations of dilutions to produce other coloured horses. This donkey, who is in fact called woodchip, is an unknown dilution that's produced very light skin, very light eyes, very light hooves, very light coat. Excuse me. In his new summer coat, he has a cream coloured body and white legs, white on his face. Excuse me. He has actually been genetically tested so that we know that he carries one gene for red, but he is in fact not a red donkey based, and also that he has no genes for spotting. So he's a solid coloured donkey. And the next one. Oh, yeah, sorry. So this colour dilution, which first occurred in a donkey in Queensland, is called cameo, as that name was established for it some years ago. It commonly produces these sort of cool-toned mid-brown donkeys with moderately diluted skin, hair, and moderately diluted eye colour as well. You can see he's got pangaree, he's got the pale muzzle and belly. He doesn't have primitive markings. I haven't actually seen a cameo with primitive markings, but I haven't seen photos of very many. There are only a small number that have been bred up from the original one. It does seem that it's a dominant gene in that the cameo jacks have had offspring to ordinary coloured jennies with that dilution. Around the world, there are other dilutes. The cameo seems to be unique to Australia. We don't know what dilution woodchip, the first cream coloured donkey, has. There's a dilution that looks somewhat like cameo that occurs in a group of donkeys in South Africa. There's a pale beige cream kind of coloured donkey among miniature or small donkeys in the USA that's called Ivory, has bluish eyes. And there's a cream coloured dilution of donkey that occurs in Hungary, and it has been known there for a very, very long time. And there's also true albino in donkeys, in other words, white with a sort of violet coloured eyes. In big animals, the eyes aren't pink like rabbits, but an unpigmented eye is a sort of a violet pink colour. Excuse me. And so there are true albino donkeys that occur on a Mediterranean island and have been taken into some parts of Europe. So now we can put on the very last picture. And, oh, no, here we go. So that donkey, you can see the short hair on his muzzle. He's a black with light points. And you can see how the short hair on the round the lips and on the end, the tip of his muzzle and along the front edge of the nostrils there's actually dark coloured hair there with white whiskers showing through. He's luckily demonstrating that for us. Because he's now an adult donkey, that one, the amount of black rimming to the nostrils has gradually gone away. So thank you very much, everyone. Are there any questions?
Helen, none of the broken colours come in the Australian Teamsters, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. The Australian Teamsters mostly derived from Middle Eastern donkeys with a bit of an infusion of Mammoth and Spanish and so on. And so none of the breeds that made them up had broken colour, which is the donkey spotted gene. That was brought into Australia in the late 70s when an English-Irish jack called, what was his name? Novington
Benjamin, yeah.
Yeah, who was a broken coloured spotted gene donkey, and people were so pleased with themselves that they had the spotted gene in Australia. They crossed him with absolutely everything. And so we very, very quickly had a large population of hybrid donkeys of every size. So you will now see donkeys of every size and type with the spotting gene, but in fact it's the same gene all over that's just been spread by crossbreeding.
Mm-hmm.
And the hallmark of a white marking, which is due to the spotting gene, just as in pinto horses, is that there's white unpigmented skin underneath the white hair, unlike roan donkeys where they might have white hair but the underlying skin is pigmented, is black.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
There's a lady with her hands up.
Yeah.
Hi, Helen.
Hello.
Hi, Helen. It's Elaine. Thank you for that, because I love listening to you, because I learn something every time. Never knew the cameo diluted colour even existed. And I'm looking forward to checking out my Jim tomorrow to actually figure out what he is, because he changed during your talks and pictures. So when you come down in a couple of weeks, I'll see if I guessed it right. But I guess my question to you is, does it sound, not that I'm a breeder, but breeders should not be breeding a spotted and a spotted together if it has such a negative result?
Well, because the foals that the embryo that has inherited the spotting gene from both parents and is doomed to die, because they very nearly inevitably die within that first couple of weeks or so after conception, there's no suffering. As I say, it does seem that in the USA they did identify a foal that was homozygous for the spotting gene and died young, but it's rare to vanishing that it ever happens, and so you're not particularly likely to cause trouble. It's very different from a gene that's called frame in horses, which produces a particularly pretty pinto pattern, But if a foal inherits frame from both parents and thus is homozygous for it instead of heterozygous, the foal is born what's called lethal white because they don't have a properly formed gut, and they die within days of birth if they're not put down before. These days, if people realise that's what's happened with a foal, they have the vet put it down rather than to leave it suffer and die. And so it's a big welfare issue with that particular colour form in horses, the frame, and they do a genetic test. Any responsible breeder in horses would do a genetic test to know that they weren't breeding frame to frame, because you can't always tell looking at the animals whether they carry that particular pattern, although usually they produce spectacular markings. Sometimes they're born with, or sometimes they have very little to show for it, and you can't tell by looking at them. But with the donkeys, it's not a welfare issue in general, and so one wouldn't say that one shouldn't. Although I think University of California, Davis actually say that people shouldn't mate spotted to spotted, just to be on the safe side.
Yeah, thank you.
Helen, are there any of these colors that do have things linked to them? So like I've had Appaloosas with the congenital night blindness and stuff. Are there any donkey colors that are risky, or are they all pretty safe?
I don't know of any such issues with the donkey colours, but I think the thing is that the dilutes are so rare and limited in their populations that there's probably issues that there could be issues that we know nothing of. Certainly the cameos in Australia and woodchip, who we don't know whether he's cameo related or not because there's no genetic test. Those animals have absolutely nothing wrong with them at all. They're perfectly healthy. The true albinos from the Mediterranean island would have trouble in bright light because completely unpigmented eyes, the red eye of a rabbit, or the sort of violet coloured eyes in larger animals, they always have visual problems because without any pigment whatsoever in the eye, the vision can't be sharpened. So humans who have albinoism and have these violet unpigmented eyes can only read halfway down an eye chart because of the leakage of light through the unpigmented tissues. And so it's an issue for people with that thing. And so no doubt the animals would have exactly the same issue, not be able to produce a sharp image in their eye. And so they would always be having difficulties. Of course, with domestication, an animal that has got some visual difficulties will have no trouble at all. Many people don't realise that their homozygous Appaloosa horse, in fact, can't see at night because the animal in captivity, it knows its yard, it knows the flat surfaces of the roads, and it just goes by hearing and smell and guess. And whereas in the wild, it'd be at risk of falling over when it tried to gallop through the bush, getting away from a predator in the night. The really interesting thing about Appaloosa in horses is the gene is 20,000 years old. There are cave paintings of spotted horses. They always thought it was artistic license, but doing genetics on ancient fossils of horses dug up in the caves of Europe, they find that the gene for Appaloosa is a mutation that occurred 20,000 years ago. So it occurred in the wild horses of Europe in small numbers. And so the heterozygous ones have night vision that's perfectly adequate. It's only the homozygous ones that don't have night vision in dim light. And I suspect people liked them and didn't hunt them and protect them. And that's why the gene could persist in spite of its deleterious effects. And every Appaloosa spotted horse in the world today is descended from some ancestral horse in the forests or plains of Europe 20,000 years ago. The same with each of these patterns that we look at in the donkeys. Each variant of roan, the donkey spotted colour, the red, each one of those mutations from the ancestral colour occurred once, and every animal with that same patterning is descended from that one mutated ancestor.
Wow.
It shows you how much crossbreeding takes place when you see spotted donkeys of every size and shape all over the world.
Christine, did you want to read your question out, or did you want me to read it out for you? So,
Excuse me, could you read it out for me?
so Christine said, please, Helen, like the camels in Australia that are so valued in the Middle East, are the grey duns therefore perhaps more pure than they are any longer in North Africa? And she's also interested in the primitive markings. Was the donkey a zebra horse combination in terms of evolution?
Right. So the thing is that donkeys are highly valued in Africa, the continent they originated in as the original wild species. They're highly valued because of their hardiness. If there's a terrible drought in places like Kenya and so on, people in the outback bush areas will turn their donkeys loose to survive as best they can while they try to save their cattle. And it's not they don't value the donkeys, but they know the donkeys can survive a drought where their cattle need extra help. And similarly in the Asian countries, the donkeys are so valued because of their hard work, but they basically have no interest in the colour whatsoever. It just happens that grey dun is the ancestral colour, and without anybody making any great effort to breed up the other mutant colours, grey dun goes on and on and on. As you know, the skin trade issues have produced terrible tragedies for many people in the donkey keeping parts of the world because their donkeys are so important. But I don't think the Australian donkeys, the feral donkeys, are especially unique in the world of donkeys, because donkeys are not actually that much different from their wild ancestors. They're the Somalian wild ass and the Nubian wild ass, which are the two subspecies of the African wild ass, are grey duns with leg stripes and primitive markings, and they are much the same size as the donkeys in the Australian bush and much the same size as the working donkeys of Africa and Asia. And the thing is that it's the kind of thing it's the way to be a donkey that survives under difficult circumstances. Little tiny donkeys need extra care because if they were in the bush, they get eaten by predators. And the big species, the big varieties like the mammoths, need a lot of extra minerals and feeding to actually grow their size and be healthy. And so with donkeys, unlike with horses and cattle and so many other domestic animals, we have an animal that's not, even though they've been domesticated for 5,000 years, we have an animal that's not much different from its wild ancestor, which I find absolutely fascinating. As far as the evolution of colour with the equines, all the equine species, the horse, the Asiatic wild asses, the African wild asses, the three zebra species, they share common ancestors several million years ago. I think the estimation at the moment is 4 or 5 million years ago. And the African wild ass and the Asiatic wild asses are more closely allied than they are to zebras, and the three zebra species are more closely allied to each other than they are to the Asiatic and African wild asses, and then the horses are the least closely related. But the splits occurred these several million years ago, and then these different species went their various ways in their various geographic zones. And when you look across all the species, you can see that every single species has got a dorsal stripe from the top of the head to the end of the tail. They've all got that. They all have some kind of dun colour body. In zebras, the background cream is the very diluted dun, but people may be aware of the animal that was called a quagga that lived in South Africa up until the end of the 1800s. It was an animal that had striped forequarters and a brown hindquarters, pale legs. The quagga they now have done genetic studies on the museum's specimens of hides and things, because they were made extinct by hunting by European settlers there. And the quagga is just a subspecies of the ordinary plains zebra. And so it's just part of the same plains zebra species, but it is described by people who witnessed it in the 1800s. It had dun coloured hindquarters and dark and light striping on the forequarters. So it was just a variant of zebra striping. Now, yes, and so with the animals, with the equines, it seems that striping had advantages with avoiding fly bites, camouflaging. Now, another little question appeared on the screen momentarily.
Are there any donkey type or donkey colours that's now extinct?
Well, I don't know about any colour forms that are extinct, because, as I say, mostly the world's donkeys are a very limited colour palette, grey duns with a few darker browns and blacks, and the ones with no light points. However, there are donkey breeds that have gone extinct because it is... The giant breeds particularly had to have a lot of attention paid to nutrition and breeding to keep them going. Some of the breeds, like the Andalusian in Spain, and have been only just saved. The Poitou donkey of France, their numbers got down to only a handful of breeding stock, but people have taken an interest again in them. In many countries, once mechanisation occurred, these giant donkey breeds that were used for breeding mules, the people lost interest in them. There wasn't any money to keep the breed going. Some of the giant breeds of Italy died out totally, and there was a breed that was referred to in old writings as the giant white riding ass of Persia. And the giant white riding ass of Persia is described as being 14 hands high and white, but it died out once they got fancy cars. So I don't know that anyone knows in what way was that ass white. Whether it was one of the dun versions that are born light and white out very fast, so that it was a black-skinned, white-haired roan donkey, one of the roan versions rather, that whites out very fast, or whether it was a dilution like a cream dilution. I don't think anybody knows. It was simply a matter that when people stopped paying attention to the breed, it just died out, and that was the end of that. The common working donkeys, of course, were then being kept by poor people, and they've kept using them because they didn't have the money for the lorries or the fancy cars.
Anybody else have any questions? All right, well, thank you, Helen, for your time. Really appreciate it. That's been super interesting.
Thank you.
Yes, definitely.
Thanks, Helen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Helen.